Good day, sir.
Hey,
How
how
are
you
you?
doing?
Rick, I am fantastic, man. How are you?
I am well too, thank you. Um, just wanted to. Let me ask you first. Did have they made any decisions to make you the permanent director?
So I'm gonna let you in because you're part of my inner circle. All
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
I got the job.
Boy, excellent, great
And
news.
we're finalizing some of the pieces right now as we speak, but they let me know that I am the one that they want to move forward with, and we're gonna take care of business, man.
Congratulations, man. That is great
Thank you.
news.
Okay, cool. So talking about critical race theory. So first, let's just tackle what it is, right?
Yes.
It's an academic concept that is honestly more than 40 years old. The core idea is that race is a social construct and that racism is not merely the product of individual biases or prejudices that may exist, but also something embedded in legal systems and in policies. It was actually the tenets of it were built for the legal injustice arguments and the things that happen in the courts. And the basic tenets of critical race theory emerged out of the framework of that analysis in the late 1970s, 1980s, I do believe, by legal scholar Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado, and amongst many others who've done writings about this. I think what has happened though is that the powers that be, and I'm not putting it on one set of folks or the other, but the powers that be that are always trying to continue to keep us at odds with each other have conflated it to be a conversation about race in general and have broken it down to two things. One, this idea that youth are not critical enough in their thinking to be able to learn about it and to talk about it, right? Which is weird because young black kids and black and brown kids have to go and experience it every single day because of the color of their skin, and they have to acknowledge and have to deal with these constructs on a day-to-day basis. So this idea that white kids in middle of America don't have the ability to be able to have a conversation about it, I think is asinine. I think the youth have always had something to say. I think us as adults have never put ourselves in a posture to listen to what they're saying. So that's one thing. And the other thing that's happening is that, and this is my personal view, and the idea of maintaining the system of white supremacy, which is actually an idea, an original construct of the systemic world that's around us here in America, and actually all around the world, because white supremacy is not, the system of white supremacy is not a American thing. It's actually a worldwide thing, and specifically the system of it. So again, taking it away from the individual, it's not about you, Rick, thinking that you're more superior than me, and you reign supreme over me. Is a systemic progress, and I think we started this conversation in our first dialogue where
Yeah.
you can look at things that have happened in history, decisions that have been made by governments, the systemic ways that, from redlining decisions to, we can talk about the myriad of things that have been done, but this is another way to maintain that system by getting laws passed to say that we can't have conversations about race in general. Like what they did in Texas is I couldn't believe it was happening in plain sight the way it was, like you
What
know
are you
that.
referring to? You're talking about the voter suppression laws?
Well, I'm talking about the law they passed about critical race theory.
Oh, that it's
And
not allowed to be taught? Did they actually
it's
pass the
not,
law?
they passed the law.
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. I knew it was talked about. I didn't realize it was passed.
Yeah, yeah. So the state of Texas, in the way in the conversation, like, yo, you're telling me that we can't have conversations about Martin Luther King? You know that that's in this bill, right? Yeah, I know that. Are you saying that we can't talk about the history of the Ku Klux Klan and how that's taking place? You know that's in this bill, right? Yeah, yeah, I know that. Like, it was
What
like,
are they afraid of?
whoa. In my opinion, it's the truth, right?
Yeah.
Because if you think about when you took history class,
Uh-huh.
when you were a youth, right, and when I took history class, there was this story and continuum of a story that was being told as to how the making of this country came to bear, and seeing different characters as heroes. But when you really tell the story from the other side of the folks who are on the other side of these things, not necessarily the case. When you tell the truth about the matter of what the how Black folks, how Black people and the Black Americans actually came to bear in this country, and what the erasure of the Native Americans in that history, and all the wars that we had in America and how we got to where we are, like, those stories are not as hunky dory as they've been told to us as we grew up.
Sure.
And so there's this idea to try to maintain those things that have continued to have the country be what it was. And now with the country coming to a place where white folks are a part of the minority and not the majority anymore, right? And these narratives from different cultures now coming to bear, so that we can have these conversations about what the heritage context is from these different populations of people, it diminishes the power that the system of white supremacy has had over the years. And then when I say years, I'm not talking about like the last 10, 15 years. No, I'm talking about hundreds of years.
Yeah.
It is now, you can see that book coming to a close.
It's long overdue. And that is something that the people who begin the process, whether in this case it happened to be white Europeans, they had the money, the power, the guns, right? So they were able to do that first. Now, one of the things that I know about critical race theory, and I'm not even sure that maybe its name throws people off. Sometimes, like, we see that all the time, like defund the police. It really has, it has some real merit to it, but I believe, and we'll get into that later, but I think that the messaging there throws people off, and they don't really know what to make of it. So critical race theory, right? A lot of people on the surface really, they don't even know what it means, because it doesn't directly correlate to what it is. So in my mind, what I think of it as is just on its most simplified terms, a way of thinking about America's history through the lens of racism. And I believe that to go back and take our whitewashed history about how great Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, these guys, they were slave owners, okay?
Yeah, right.
For example, those kinds of people who we hold up, as idols, put monuments up, and so people are saying, no, these people weren't that great of people. Well, in context, listen, that's what a museum is for. It's for the good, the bad, the ugly. I mean, there's a Holocaust museum in Israel, right? We can't ignore and deny what happened. We hold it's a truth. Even Germany understands that. Okay, it's just part of your history. So it's like saying to keep Barry Bonds out of the Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame is merely a museum. He should be in the Hall of Fame, in my opinion. And as if steroids or performance-enhancing drugs were part of the game at the time, okay, they were wrong. We're gonna also spell that out, and it is what it is. So hey, there are guys in the Hall of Fame like Ty Cobb, apparently, who were really bad guys, right? They were abusers of women and all kinds of systems. And do we take them out because they were bad guys? No, people are bad people who were good who were influential in history. Okay, from Napoleon to Alexander the Great and all these things, and we learn more about them. So it just has to be added to the story so that you can make up your own mind about it. And as I listen to people over and over, I don't know how you can remove things like Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, these Malcolm X, anybody in especially in the civil rights movement, right? It came about because enough is enough, and racism was so prevalent in policy, in making laws, in separation, and it just absolutely, from kids going to school to people buying homes to people getting jobs, it had to stop. So it came to a head, right? And now we're talking about it in retrospect. And I think the fear from white America, quite frankly, is that, we're going to teach our kids to hate white people. We're teaching them about being guilty for what they've done. And I don't know that's necessarily the case.
It's not.
I think you can actually teach someone. I didn't have anything to do with slavery, but I regret it. I recognize it's a black eye it's a stain on America's past. And I'm okay with that. This is an imperfect union, and we're looking to make improvements and get better. And the only way to do that is to recognize where you've gone wrong in the past so you don't repeat those mistakes.
Talk about it. Well, so here's the thing. Just a couple. It, this situation itself with critical race theory, I feel like, is a way of watching how how the system works out in the open, right? Because a lot of times these things happen behind closed doors, like,
Of course.
these decisions that are made, and you don't know what's going on. But because we're in this age where we have 24-hour news cycles, social media is so prevalent, and everybody is watching, the world is always watching, you're seeing these things actually play out in the real world. So if you're paying attention, it's these small sleight of hands that are taking place. It's like, oh, how did they do that, right? um
Right.
so for instance, even in the late, like, critical race theory, as I mentioned, the most important part is this is not a new theory. It's 40 years in the making, right? Like, and it's not just about racism, it's systemic racism, right? Talking about the system. So what they did was they took the name of something to put it on the front of something different that they're afraid of, which is the truth about the history of the way that the world has really transpired, and having their children learn about this history, and also about the privilege that exists around them. And I think it's not about the guiltiness of, like, what your family did to slaves and maybe being a slave owner. That's not that. I don't think that's what it is. I think there's a conversation around, yeah, there's a level of privilege that you have based on how the history was actually, the history of this country has actually come to bear. And it's not that you may feel guilty once you learn that, like, dang, I didn't even realize that these things that I see as normal are actually privileges that other people don't even actually get a chance to take advantage of at all, or don't even see, or can't even think or fathom about doing, that I just do naturally just because of the color of my skin. You know, I don't know what that feeling would look like, because I'm not a white man. I'm not a white woman. So I don't know what the feelings come up when you start to learn these things. And
Mhm.
I think, but I also know that in my mind as a parent, if my child is learning something new about something that I may have been keeping from them, right? Then I feel a way about whoever is teaching them the things that I was trying to make sure that they didn't know,
Wow.
and not consciously or subconsciously, that I was
Sure.
keeping from them,
Sure.
right? So I
Well,
think that's where all this rises up, because the children are involved. So don't be, you can't shape the mind of my child and I not be involved. Well, I
yeah.
mean, that's another part, for another day, I guess. But there I think it goes deep, man. There's a whole bunch of different pieces to this, but I just want to make sure that we stay, when we're talking about critical race theory and what it actually is. It is looking at the world through the eyes of systemic racism, and how the system has put these things forward. I'll end by saying this. A perfect example of this: 15th Amendment gets passed in America, right? 13, 14, 15th Amendment, all really important amendments for the country. 10 years after the 15th Amendment is passed, Jim Crow laws come into play, right? So behind closed doors, and all these different decisions that were made state by state by state, particularly in the South, it took 10 years to take the progress that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment actually created, to actually throw everything back into the dark ages again, with the black codes, and as well as the Jim Crow laws that actually came to bear and were put on the books.
For our
So
listeners, just remind us right now, real quick, what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment did for the country, and then just describe an example of one or two Jim Crow laws, because we hear these terms, but people don't actually know them. So I don't want to assume for a second that everyone knows exactly what you're talking about. So I want to spell it out in 30 seconds or less.
yeah, no problem. So the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment, well, it outlawed slavery, but also changed it to say that if you are in jail, though, you can be slave. But that's a different conversation for a different day. 14th Amendment reversed Dred Scott, which is due process and equal protection clauses, which was very important for black folks. In the 15th Amendment, states couldn't deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous conditions of servitude.
And
So it
when
gave
was
the
that?
right to vote
When
to
was it? When were
folks.
those passed?
These were actually called, like, the Civil War amendments. So they were passed. It took some time. It was over time that the 13th, 14th Amendment 14th Amendments were actually
And
passed.
15th was that still the 1800s or is that 19? I don't know. I don't know my history well enough to
No,
know.
I do believe the 15th Amendment was passed in the 1900s. I'll give you the date because the first black votes actually took place. I think that was around 1900s, like 1909.
Yeah, because it's interesting. Now, black men,
Hmm.
right? Because
Black
women
men were able to vote. Women
women
didn't
to
get to
get
vote.
the right to vote till like 1926 or something.
Exactly, bro.
Yeah,
Yes, that is true. And
right.
so it took years to put the pieces. The black codes were first. When I talk about the black codes and what they are, you know, they were the restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans and ensure their availability for cheap labor. So, the ideas of sharecropping and the rules of how that came into bear, and that black folks couldn't own land. The covenants that were put in place as well. These were like codified things that still kept black folks in their places. And then the full version of those things coming to bear were actually the Jim Crow laws that we know of, that existed longer than what we see in the pictures in the 1950s and 1960s. White and black water fountains and white and black bathrooms, and not being able to go into certain restaurants to be able to eat and all those types of things. So
And those were actual laws.
yeah, those are actual laws.
See, that to me is what's crazy. When you see pictures in black and white of like drinking fountains that were white and colored, or restaurants or hotels or whatever. I thought those were sort of state by state kind of policies that weren't actually put into law, that people were just too afraid to challenge because of the states they were in.
Mm-hmm.
And
No,
I didn't
man,
realize
these were laws.
that somebody had taken the time to actually pass a law that said people couldn't drink from the same water fountain.
Yeah, these were laws.
I mean, so going back to 1860, if you had to place a bet on who would get to vote first, white women or black men, what would you have said?
During that time frame?
Yeah, in 1860, before the emancipation, I would have guessed white women for sure, hands down.
Absolutely, man. Hands down,
Right?
like hands down, hands down. And in
Yeah.
fact, I want to make sure I get the dates right on this, right? So if you don't mind, as we're
No,
talking through,
please. Yeah.
I'm gonna look
Everybody.
up these things.
Yeah.
So you got the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, right, of the Constitution. And the 15th Amendment itself, the date on this is actually ratified February 3rd, 1870, right? Is when that was actually ratified. The women's right to vote amendment, the women's suffrage, is the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920, right? So, another conversation we can maybe have in the future is about patriarchy
Yeah.
and how that is played out.
Right.
But I think as we begin to start to unveil some of these things, we'll actually get to parts of the conversation around classism and patriarchy and how all those things kind of play out across the spectrum as well. But yeah,
There's a great book, I think we may have spoken about it once, called the Declining Significance of Race, and that prejudice has shifted to classism.
Yeah, man.
In many areas, we used to white neighborhoods wanted to stay white and they wanted to keep people out. Now they want to keep poor people out, even if they are white. They'd rather have a more diverse neighborhood where it keeps the value of their homes up, regardless of what their ethnicity is.
Yeah, for sure.
More diverse cities, obviously rural areas might, contradict that, and you can always give me an exception. But by and large, I think in larger urban centers, we're much more concerned about the value of our properties and things of that nature, regardless of the ethnicity. I think people still have their preferences as to which race they would want in their community, but I think it matters less than having somebody who's going to drive their property values down because they don't keep up their home.
Yeah, man. That part is really interesting because even in the home values piece and the access to even having homes, it brings you to the redlining conversation and how redlining even came to bear. Out of the time frame of when those who were coming back from the war were supposed to have access to opportunities to buy homes, and stuff like that, and have guaranteed loans from the government. But in the codes themselves, Black folks were actually excluded from that, even though they fought in the wars. You know what I mean?
Wow.
The covenants that were actually written, even here in Los Angeles, as progressive as we think this city is and this county is, covenants in cities all across Los Angeles County that kept Black folks from being able to move into those places, right? And so, when you directly tie how the resources from a tax standpoint in a particular area are tied to the ownership of homes, and you have places where people are not owning homes, or the value of those homes are so low, which means that the tax base in order to have the resources are going to be low, you can imagine why the hospitals or the fire departments or the operations of a city in more impacted communities would not be as nice in a more as it is in a more affluent community. So like the history of all these things, and this is why critical race theory became really important as they were going through the laws to try to upend some of the things that were keeping these ideals in place. Critical race theory became important because it instead of having to deal with a case by case basis of how to prove racism in a particular system, it created a better framing of how systemic racism exists in all the laws because of the history of the country.
Such an important point. Jim Crow laws are out in front of your face, so they're hard to deny. How did some of these backroom deals, like redlining, that wasn't really a law, right?
No.
It was a policy by banks and people in back rooms. How did that ever see the light of day and get out? How did people learn about this? And how was it not the best kept secret in the banking and insurance, loan type of industries that we know about so much of it now?
Public information requests, and actually reading what's there. Jim Crow, started in the South for racial segregation in 1877, right? So from 1877 to 1950, this is why those laws, the 13, 14, 15 Amendment, were so important, because it started to undo the things that the Jim Crow laws actually had in place, right? And so they reincorporated a lot of those things state by state, especially in the South. But the civil rights movement was a continuance of the work that was happening during Reconstruction, right? So it's a continued arc of history, for lack of a better term, that is not just points in time, but it's a continuum, right? And so the energy from one moment where may have been success or progress, that there's still ongoing drumbeat of the work to be able to maintain those things until you get to the next linchpin in history where things actually take place as well, right?
Well, there's always been a lag time for the time a law gets passed to the time it gets actually implemented into society throughout.
Yeah,
it's not the
absolutely.
next day, unless you're talking about, in the example of like women get to vote. It's just one thing to happen. But, when you're talking about Jim Crow laws, undoing all of that, it took a long time to do, so it's going to take a long time to undo. Generations, in fact, because people still believe in, and you're not going to tell certain people how to act or behave, even if it's against the law to still.
Right, man. And so it's really, you hit the nail on the head. And going back to the question that you asked about how do you know about the things that came to bear, we know these things because of the work that was done in the justice work, to uncover, again, bringing it back to critical race theory.
Yeah,
those folks, the Derek Bells and the Kimberly Crenshaws of the world, who were doing that work to support Thurgood Marshall and Charles Alexander Hamilton from Howard University, like those folks who are actually leading the way from and working to undo the challenges that were in the world based on what was actually on the books in this country. This is where a lot of that information comes out into play. And so you look back with your magnifying glass and watch what happened during that time in history, you realize, oh man, like the implicit biases that existed because of the way that Black folks actually exist in this country from the very beginning, were the reason why decisions were made. Black folks were always not even a class. They started off as a commodity, not even a class of people.
Right.
So if that is built into the history of what you believe about a person, right, then the decisions about them being included in being equal to you, right? As someone who has benefited from the way the structures are set up, that is not top of mind. That's the reason why Jim Crow laws can exist,
It
because
would
they're
have been,
not
they would have
equal
been
to me.
considered a whole person at one time.
Exactly. The three-fifths compromise, man. Come on, man. We
Right.
can talk about all this stuff, Rick. Like, so
I think,
I'm bringing all this to say, like,
yeah.
critical race theory and the way that they approached it became such a necessary tool because it helped in the way to upend some of the laws that created the injustices in the first place.
Man, it's such a fascinating conversation. I love this banter with you because it's rooted with you and me in honesty. And it's two guys who couldn't come from two more different places, right? Between you and I. And
I agree.
And we come to this conversation with an open mind and a willingness to learn. And so I might come with my preconceived biases, but I'm open-minded to be able to say, Derek, change my mind. Tell me where I've got it wrong. Now, a lot of people in their history, including myself, this is why a lot of people make comparisons to Jews and blacks, that they've both, been persecuted and suffered, not in any way identical in any way, and there's no comparison.
Yeah, I got you.
Right, but when my background, being a Jewish American, having my family escape from Europe and the Holocaust and Nazism and all that stuff, is a real, embedded fear. Now I get to sort of hide it because my name is Brown, and that's not an obvious Jewish one. I'm white, so I can kind of get by where people don't know it right away. But as soon as they find out, there's implicit prejudice against me, and it's sort of I find it sometimes comical when people act anti-Semitic in front of me, and as though I'm part of their group, like I should be in on the joke.
Man, isn't that the worst feeling too? Like, oh yeah, we're fine. Like we can just say, it's so weird, bro. Like, but that's that privilege of being able to say whatever and not really
telling you, man. I had a client of mine one time say to me, I was going to sell him this piece of equipment, and we had a deal going, and he said, "All right, let's go in my office, see if I can Jew you down." And I'm like, "Well, that sounds like fun."
Gee, money, gunning.
And it's just
wow.
like the ignorance goes on, and then it's like, wow, I guess I didn't. So it's kind of interesting how it's just, and those kinds of things happen, and I mean, to this day I have friends who are they've grown up with it, and so they don't even know that they're being offensive, right? And so you have to be at least sensitive enough to the people who you're talking to, because it is no longer about the intention of the offender. It's all about the perception of the offendee. And so you have a choice to make. You could say, well, I don't really care what anyone thinks. I'm just going to say what words I want to say. And as long as I don't mean them to be offensive, I'm clear. I'm good.
Right.
You're okay. But I think that a more modern and just society will actually be a little bit more thoughtful. Now, yes, I think we're taking it in some cases too far, but that's the nature of the pendulum, right? People are getting canceled over things they said 10 years ago. And I always wonder about that. 20 years ago, a guy got fired from the Olympics. I was watching, who does a good piece on this is Bill Maher. He's really opposed.
Oh, HBO, real time. Yeah.
Yeah. He's opposed to people getting canceled for things they did, many years ago. I mean, one guy was, they learned that he bullied somebody in the 8th grade. And it's like, well, who didn't bully? That was your time, stick out your chest on the playground, right?
Yeah.
And so you hopefully you learn your ways and become a productive adult. And, you're no longer that. If you bullied somebody as an adult, okay, then I get it, where we have a better conversation. But anyway, so that's neither here nor there. But I think there's a lot to unpack here. I think that we're going to continue this conversation, and I think that we should dive into it with a little bit more specifics on the next go around, and we'll move on to another topic. Do you know some of the things I want to talk about next time as well, which I think that you and I we'll email about here, is some of the remarkable influences of African Americans early on, and how that changed all of this. So who comes to mind, obviously, is Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois, and just Martin Luther King Jr. I'm talking about, just absolute game changers, and people who overcame and forced people to look differently. And so I'd love to talk about the obvious ones, and then maybe there's some not so obvious ones, leaders of industry, legal scholars, people who also were game changers. I think that is worth, kind of demonstrating where we began to head in the right direction, right? And to this day, we're still, we talk about critical race theory. What I notice about it, when you talk about, especially what surprises me is that to hear from you is it's been about for 40 years, because really in the last 20 minutes, it's become a lightning rod for most Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's what if it's been around so long, why only now are we hearing that it's such a big deal, right? Maybe because it's being taught to our kids finally. That must be their trigger point.
I think, man. So let's talk about what the Democrats are doing at the same time.
Yeah.
Right. So on Joe Biden's platform is racial equity, right? And when you start to talk about equity rather than equality, you're also talking about resource reallocation, right? To make sure that we're undoing the harm that the way the system has impacted folks and put them at a deficit, being able to address those things. Well, that also changes the way the system is operated for folks who have actually been winning during that time, who don't want to have that conversation.
Right.
So what is the other side of doing the work of racial equity? Well, let's talk about doing away with critical race theory. Because if there's not people learning about these things, then we no longer have to worry about the system changing at all, and we can continue business as usual.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned about that diverse cabinet because, you know, people on the other side, you know, again, I could be critical of everybody. I'm a centrist. I don't vote for any party line, right? I'm an independent thinker. I'm not ashamed if Donald Trump had a great idea, I'd tip my hat to him. If Joe Biden did, super, you know, but if they fail to execute on something, I'll be just as critical of either side. And what I noticed, I was watching, you know, Donald Trump Jr. He's a very active social media guy, and of course he loves to be critical at any time, and he doesn't see the irony in it too. He said talking about Hunter Biden recently and said, imagine if what the media would do to me if I was the son of a rich guy and didn't do anything on my own. And I was like, brother, have you seen who you yourself? I mean, but he said recently about the incompetence of the withdrawal in Afghanistan, which we're seeing, right? And how bad of an execution that was. There's a lot of generals, you know, in hindsight said, well, listen, what you do is you fly in 10,000 personnel, a whole bunch of planes, you secure the airport, you start getting people out. It's a systematic thing. And then those soldiers are the last one out. You don't race out in the middle of the night and have this chaos where people are clinging to airplanes and whatever. And so Donald Trump Jr., I think he tweeted something like, well, at least Joe Biden has a diverse cabinet, you know? And I was like, dude, that is the worst. There's, you know, one has nothing to do with the other, and to conflate those two issues of competence with diversity, man, just shows me your true colors.
Absolutely, man.
Right? And there's so many people fighting on it. And this is my problem with it, is that there's not a fringe group that is actually on board with that, right? Gun toting, big truck driving, small, tiny group. This is actually a much bigger group than I care for it to be, right? I don't mind when fringes get a whole bunch of news coverage because I'm smart enough to know that's what sells news, right? That's part of the news cycle. So the fringy left, the fringy right, okay, that should be a very small part of our society. But is it?
But see, this is the reason why the conversations that we're having, Rick, become very important, because the reason why a large swath of folks are actually taking this on is because it's touching on something that is a fundamental tenet of the American culture. And that privilege that has always existed, being diminished in any way, causes rifts.
Right.
And nobody likes that. You know, when you're the beneficiary of the privilege itself, knowingly or unknowingly.
Yeah, right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
But I tell you what, even especially when it's unknowing and things start to be shifted on you, you start looking around like, what is happening? Like it's like an earthquake, you know, you walk in doing your daily life and everything, or sitting at your desk, and then the world starts to shift around you.
Yeah.
You start looking around and blaming anything if you don't know what an earthquake is, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure.
And that's the thing, like this shift that's happening, people can't talk, they don't know how to talk about it because they are not knowledgeable ever of the existence of it, because they've just existed in the world and it just has always been what it's been.
Yeah.
The only people who have seen the effects of it is the folks on the other side of it. You know?
100%. You know, they say that racism in the Northeast is much more difficult for Black folks because it's subversive, whereas, you know, they feel more comfortable with the racism that might exist down South because they know where they stand. And so
Yeah, exactly.
I saw a piece on that where Boston was considered the most racist city in America. I don't know if that's true or not, but it has its history in that regard.
Hmm.
And so they had a guy with a camera and a microphone and asked people, went to Boston and said, hey, do you think that's an unfair characterization of Boston? And they go, oh yeah, I don't know any racists. I don't know any racist people, right? It is. I just interviewed a bunch of white people, and it's sort of funny. It's every single one of them says, oh no, we're not racist here.
Exactly.
And then I was just waiting for one of them to go, you know, hey, one of my best friends is a Black guy, you know. Over here. It's like it's this weird argument that people make that, you know, in 2021 you think, man, aren't we past this yet?
Yeah.
And
But see, but that part of it though, and aside, I believe that, you know, when coming back to, I think, a previous conversation we have about centering Blackness and or actually solving anti-Blackness in all of this,
yes.
it's because anti-Blackness is synonymous with white supremacy, right? And so if you actually put your light on how to solve the anti-Blackness problem, and because it's diametrically opposed to solving that, is diametrically opposed to maintaining the system as is, because Black folks are at the bottom of a lot of different things. So if you're putting the energy into doing that, you start to unearth and uncover a lot of things that you had no idea actually really existed in the world, right?
Yeah.
But that part of the work is difficult. But, you know, creating using equity as a pathway towards liberation is not just liberation of Black folks when you're doing that. It's actually liberating everybody who's a part of the system. You see what I'm saying? Perfect example of this. If we're having this conversation around school police and the importance of their presence on school campuses, like why are they there, right? So if you eliminate police off of school campuses, particularly because of their interaction with Black folks, right? This is just bear with me here.
Yeah.
You do that, you're not just changing the school atmosphere for Black students by getting rid of the police. The police being on campus impacted everybody who was there, from the staff members who are there, the teachers that are there, every single student that is there, every parent that is volunteered there, right? So you created a whole new paradigm on that campus for everybody who has something to do with that campus, mainly because of the specific reason of the police's negative impact of Black students. You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
So I'm saying you extrapolate that across the entire field of all the things that you would want to be tackling anti-Blackness on, right? You're creating a liberated world for everybody. But what is liberation, Derek? I'm not creating some abstract world. Like, liberated worlds already exist. All you gotta do is go to Beverly Hills, where white folks don't have to worry about the police in Beverly Hills. You know what I'm saying? Or the school systems, because of the resources that are there, folks live whole lives, and in most cases, more than whole lives in those particular places of affluence. So I'm saying, when I say liberated lives, I'm saying all of us being able to have the ability to live whole and full lives, because the resources that we have are abundant, and we just need to make sure that we're taking care of each other when it comes down to these things. So
I think so. And when I think about the civil rights movement forward, okay, from roughly 65 to where we are now, I feel like we made a lot of progress. And then during the Trump era, I feel like we gave some of that progress back. Have we made any real net progress in this that we can take some solace in and be proud of as a society? And what's the next step of progress that we can do as a community, as neighbors, as society? Not, you know, especially in light of the division that we now have between the left and the right politically, but just in terms of race, what progress have we made net, and what can we do to make the next leap of progress? What steps can we take as a society, as a community?
Man, you know, it depends on what you believe progress is, man. Like, I'll give you an indicator of what I'm talking about. You look at the desegregation of schools all the way up to what that looks like now.
Mm-hmm.
And in most cases, it's worse now than it was then. Right?
Sure.
So is that progress? You know what I mean? Like when you look at
you say it's worse now because Black neighborhoods are impoverished and they're relegated to those schools, and even though it's not legally bound, the integration is still available, but now it's rooted in poverty. Is that what you're suggesting?
And the poverty has gotten worse because of
okay.
the minimum wage. The wages of folks has actually not increased. The cost of living has increased significantly. Ownership has not necessarily increased in those communities, which means that the resources that are allocated to those schools is not as high as it should be, right? So in certain areas where the affluence is there, those have seen the increase, but the communities of color and most impacted communities have not seen an increase, and if anything, have gotten worse.
Mm-hmm.
And white folks are not coming to move in these areas and go to these schools. And when they do, it's in mass and taking over those communities to become a place of influence where people of color are moving out because they can't afford to be there. You know what I'm saying? So
like what's happening potentially in Inglewood now around the SoFi Stadium.
Absolutely. Yes.
Oh, East Hollywood and you know that area over there.
Echo Park and all that.
Yeah. That may have been more Latino, but nonetheless, I hear your point. Progress for me, as I look at it, in as far as racism in America, that we can try to take some solace in, and whether it's mandated or not, which in many industries it is, right? So you have affirmative action for college, so they've required it. But like in Hollywood right now, it's really being called out, and you see a lot more African American, positions within the structure. Maybe not a studio head, but some people said, fuck it, let's just go make our own studio. Tyler Perry and Oprah, and you've got some real people out there with some power and influence. Jay-Z and what they're doing. The music industry, hip hop is almost owned, in large part. So, but seeing directors, right, sound engineers, composers, not just actors and actresses, which I think is fantastic, right? Especially the Oscars have been really calling people out there. So I feel like there's been progress made where the diversity is a plus, is a benefit. It almost has to be required in some cases because you're being shamed into it. However we get there, it feels like at some point in time, it'll be, hopefully in my mind, as I project into the future, it'll just seem so natural that we won't call him a Black director, right? He'll just be a director.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
A Black lawyer. He'll just be a lawyer. Why does he have to be anything? Somebody said to me recently, I was on this trip with a bunch of white guys in Wisconsin, and I was clearly the only guy who was Jewish. And they said, "Oh man, you would have made a great Jewish lawyer." And I said, "Couldn't I have just made a good lawyer?" It's like, where's the distinction there? And I think his implication was that I know how to make money, or I set up a couple bets on the golf course with these guys, and it was it was sort of easy takings, but that's kind of where they were going with it. But so that to me is in my mind what progress looks like. But yeah, I think there's some areas of where you can see clearly progress has stalled and made we've made very little.
I would go with you on that to say that doors have been open where they were closed. Yes, that is absolutely true.
And so I feel like we can take solace in that, and continue the work there. What can we do? What can people listening to this? I'm always curious. What can I do? I'm just one guy. Okay, so I'm calling out my friends for racist jokes. I'm not allowing anybody in my circle anymore to use terms that I find offensive. Right, even though I'm not Black, I still don't. I don't want to hear the N-word. It's cringeworthy. Okay, it's absolutely. There's no place for it in our society. Okay, and there's a great piece, by the way, which I want you to listen to, and we'll talk about maybe next time, because I think it's a subject matter that I think is great. And it really started early on with the great Richard Pryor. He said at one point in time, "I'm no longer going to use the N-word." Okay, now his daughter, Liz Pryor, is just an incredible scholar and a professor at I think it's Smith College in Massachusetts. Anyway, she used to live here in LA where she grew up, and our daughters went to school together, and I got to know her a little bit. And so we'd have these conversations, and she's a real critical thinker. And I saw she did a TED Talk, an amazing TED Talk, which I encourage you to listen to, and anybody else who's interested on the N word, on its origin, when it became, miserable, why certain people still are allowed to use it and do. When I listen to Snoop, who I just find to be as funny and entertaining as anybody, it bugs me a little bit the way, but he says it in a way that's almost funny, especially when he's doing like voiceovers for animals or stuff like that. You can't not laugh, right? It takes on a little bit more serious tone when Cube does it, right? And because he comes from a place in Compton, and his whole NWA history is just makes it much more real in his experiences. So I get that. But I want you to listen to what she has to say about it, because she articulates it in a way that I find to be better than anywhere else I've ever heard, for people who are interested in, hey, where did this come from? Why did it get to be so bad, so offensive, and then and that kind of stuff. But getting back to what my original point was, when we pack that later, is what can I do as an individual, right, out there to continue this progress? I mean, is it about visiting Black-owned businesses? Is it about trying to hire more diversity within your organization? What are some of the things that people can think about and do to help this progress? If we make a 1-inch progress every day, eventually we're going to get a mile.
I think each time we have this conversation, I'm always going to come back to the same thing, Rick.
Please.
Here at the Social Justice Learning Institute, all roads start with empowerment through education, right? Because the more you know, the more you can understand your role and what is going on around you, so that you can be the one that can be a catalyst for creating a thriving community around you, right? And when you do that and creating that empowering and community around you, you're also educating those folks and empowering them to do the same thing. And when we have enough of us who are all working towards the idea of creating a thriving community, we can change systems together, right? So I don't necessarily have the answer to directly tell you, hey, do this and do this and do that, and that solves it. Like, it's because it's not that. I think there is a full understanding of what's happening in this continuum of the story that is history, right? All sides of what that looks like, so that you can say, okay, so I understand how we got here. I'm in this moment right now. So here's what I'm going to do, right? And what you're going to do is going to look different than what I do. It's going to look different than what my wife does, which is going to look different than what our peers will do, right? Because it is our individual pieces that are a part of this larger whole of how we transform things. But if we are seeking understanding and also educating ourselves about the view of the world outside of my own view, right? I think we put ourselves in a posture to be able to be transformative with each other along the way,
It's fascinating. It's fascinating. I'm doing my part, right? One of the things I'm doing is mentoring. You at the Social Justice Learning Institute, you have a scholars program there.
Exactly. We're teaching the leaders of tomorrow today.
And we're inspiring kids who didn't think that they could go to college. They might be the first generation graduates of high school in their family, right? And so I have now 9 scholars at the Always Up Foundation that I'm mentoring, right? And they're at various ages. And I just picked up 3 more. And it's a diverse group of men and women, Black, brown. I've got an Asian gal who's from China. And, so they're going to different places. They all come from different places mentally, right? And culturally. And what I find so fascinating about them is how education is such an important part of their family's culture. And I say family, and not because I don't think that you can say culturally one ethnicity is more tied into education. people used to say, well, when the Jews got here, right, with nothing on their back after the Holocaust, right, their culture there, they're more into education, right? Well, you could say that about the Chinese, the Indian community is heavily, so it does very
So are black folks. Black women are like the highest graduates of graduate school across the country. So I see what you're saying. To your
that's
point,
my point, though. That's exactly
exactly
my point. So you can't say it about any one group, and it doesn't also have to do with anything I find with socioeconomics, because a lot of these people are poor, but they want to get out. They want to make something of themselves, and it comes down to having a belief system in yourself that typically comes from somebody who inspires you, a love of reading, right? However you get it, whether you're escaping something else, you're desiring to go somewhere else, further, however it happens. And that's the beauty of education, is it's really for everybody. So maybe on the next discussion, one of these next discussions, I'd love to bring in some of these scholars and have more of a roundtable discussion, so we could bring in what some of the younger people are thinking about, kids that are 18, 19, 20, who are going to top universities in this country, and I'd love to hear more about what their young minds think about what you and I are trying to unpack, which is typically a more mature conversation, but they've been living it too.
Yeah, I was about to say, man, I push back and say it's a more mature conversation, because I think the youth will surprise you on their take on what's happening in the world around us. And, their lived experience may not be as high, but because that's not the case, because it's not as much in their lived experience, the way that they can see it and the simplicity of their solutions is a value add that we don't necessarily have the ability to have. Because our lived experience is so much.
That's right? so well put, and it's so true, because I find that to be true. Sometimes when you're an adult, you look at a problem and you try to put a complex solution together because you're smarter. When you're simpler and younger, sometimes there's a simpler solution that you can see clearly, because you're not bogged down by the complexities of trying to solve it in a complex way. And adults have a tendency to do that. So when I talk to these kids, it's so refreshing. Now, I have these kinds of discussions all the time with them, and we talk about where they are, and the one thing that I try to impress upon them is that no matter who here makes you feel like you don't belong for any reason, I promise you belong here as just as much as anyone else does.
Absolutely.
Never forget that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a feel-good moment, and man, I really appreciate your time. I can't wait to have more of these discussions. There's so much.
I'm here for it.
It just makes me feel good, and makes me feel, just alive, knowing that we're thinking, we're growing, right, and we're coming together.
I hear you, man. There's a couple corrections I want to make on some of the things I said.
Please.
It's not Charles Alexander Hamilton. That is a historical white man in the history of America. I was talking about Charles Hamilton Houston from Howard University.
Gotcha.
That was working alongside and also did some of the training of Thurgood Marshall during his time, and so there's the rich history there. I also want to mention you're spot on with the way that we engage in the youth and have them be a part of this. I think these dialogues and these conversations are a huge contribution, to what can be done. Because the first thing that I believe that needs to be done is for us to actually listen and to learn from each other, right? So I'm here for these conversations. Rick, thanks for having me be a part of it.
Dude, I'm so happy that we, being able to build this friendship and have these kind of open conversations, because one is, if no one else hears them, I get to learn, and we get to experience this together. Growth. And if it's just you and me, I'm okay with that. But I have a feeling that somehow through grassroots, we're going to push this thing out onto a some kind of podcast, and we're going to inspire other people and if we can inspire just one person to talk about this and to think differently, we've accomplished so much.
For sure, man. I agree with you. So I'm here for it. Let's build it.
I got it every other Thursday on our calendar. If for some reason you can't make it, no big deal. We'll change it. We'll switch it where our lives are busy. And if you want to email some topics so we can be a little more prepared for them, we'll talk about that Liz Pryor, TED Talk. I want to talk to you about some people who I've been following a little bit as well. Do you know who? I think his name is Damati Pongo. He was on MTV. He's just a super smart guy, young guy. He reminds me of that W. Kamau Bell, I think it is. CNN, but
Yeah, I'm seeing it.
yeah, check out Dometi, Dometi, Dometi Pongo. And he's just a really smart guy who has a lot to say. And the other one is Lonnie Bunch. You know who that is?
Lonnie Bunch. No, I don't.
All right.
I found Domity though. I'm gonna see what's up with him.
Okay. Yeah. He's a really smart guy, and he's getting a message across to a lot of people. And I saw.
You said Lonnie Bunch?
Yeah.
Okay.
So those are people I wanted to kind of talk to you about as well, and then figure out how we can incorporate things like those subject matters.
All right, cool.
So yeah, he is the historian in charge of the. He's the first African American secretary in the
Oh, the
cabinet
Smithsonian.
at
Oh,
the Smithsonian
wow.
Institution. He's a historian. He's done. This guy knows so much. And so, if we ever got like